kill a king is more than just murder. For centuries, it was seen as the ultimate sin against both God and the state. The act of regicide, killing a monarch, has always been met with a special kind of fury. It's a crime so profound that the punishment couldn't just end a life. It had to be a terrifying lesson, burned into the collective memory of an entire nation. But even by those extreme standards, the fate of one man stands in a category all its own. His punishment was designed to be so agonizing, so long, and so completely destructive that it would be the final word on treason. This is the story of a man whose death became one of the most gruesome public spectacles in history. They burned his hand off with molten sulfur. They used red-hot pincers to tear chunks of flesh from his body, then poured a boiling stew of lead, oil, and tar into the open wounds. Finally, they brought in 4 powerful horses to rip him, limb from limb, in front of the entire city of Paris. This wasn't a scene from a horror movie. This was the state-sanctioned punishment for François Ravaillac, the man who assassinated France's King Henry IV. This is the story of history's most horrific public execution. Before he was a monster in the eyes of France, François Ravaillac was just a man lost in a storm of religious passion and personal failure. Born in 1578, he came from a respectable family of lawyers and clerks. But his own home life was a wreck. His father was a violent man who wasted the family's money, while his mother was intensely, almost obsessively, religious. This mix of chaos at home and extreme piety seems to have warped Ravaillac's mind from a young age. He was a man desperately searching for purpose, but all he found was rejection. He tried working as a teacher and a legal clerk, but he believed his true calling was a life devoted to God. Yet, when he tried to join a strict monastic order, he was kicked out. The monks said he was a prey to visions, too unstable even for them. A later attempt to join the Jesuits also failed. Turned away by the very institutions he admired, Ravaillac was left alone with his visions and a burning, fanatical energy with nowhere to go. That obsession soon found a target, the King of France, Henry IV. Now, to understand what drove Ravaillac, you have to understand the king he decided to kill. Henry IV was one of the most important figures in French history. Known as Good King Henry, he had inherited a kingdom shattered by decades of religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants, known as the Huguenots. Henry himself was born a Protestant and had been their leader for years. He only got the crown after converting to Catholicism, supposedly saying, "Paris is well worth a mass." But this move didn't really satisfy anyone. To hardline Catholics, he was a heretic just pretending, a traitor to the true faith. To the Protestants, his conversion was a bitter betrayal. Henry's greatest achievement was the Edict of Nantes in 1598. It was a revolutionary act that granted Protestants significant rights in a Catholic nation, all to bring peace to France. But for Catholic extremists, the edict was a deal with the devil. It was an official tolerance of heresy, an unforgivable compromise. This is the polarized world where Ravaillac's personal demons found a political cause. He started having visions that he was on a divine mission. At first, he just wanted to convince the king to cancel the Edict of Nantes and force all the Huguenots to convert. He traveled to Paris 3 times to try and get a meeting with Henry, but failed every time. Frustrated and unable to deliver his divine message, his obsession began to twist into something much darker. The final straw was Henry's foreign policy. In 1610, the king was preparing to send his army into Germany, a move that would pit France against the powerful Catholic Habsburg dynasty of Spain. To Ravaillac's fevered mind, this was the ultimate betrayal. He saw it as the king declaring war on the Pope himself, and therefore on God. The failed monk now saw his purpose with terrifying clarity. If he couldn't convert the king, he would kill him. On May 14th, 1610, his chance came. The king's carriage got stuck in a traffic jam on a narrow Paris street. The king was sitting in the open, an easy target. Ravaillac, who had been stalking him, saw his moment. He jumped onto the carriage wheel, leaned in, and stabbed a knife deep into the king's chest. The first blow wounded him. The second struck his aorta and was fatal. François Ravaillac had just killed the king. He was immediately grabbed by the crowd and was nearly lynched on the spot, but the king's guards saved him. They knew that for a crime this huge, a quick death in the street would never be enough. The state had to have its turn. With the king dead, shock and panic ripped through Paris. Assassinating a monarch wasn't just murder. It threatened to plunge the entire kingdom back into civil war. The throne passed to Henry's 9-year-old son, Louis XIII, and the Queen, Marie de Medici, took control. Their first, most urgent job was to reassert the power of the crown, and their main instrument for doing that was the body of François Ravaillac. His punishment had to be more than an execution. It had to be a horrifying piece of political theater. Ravaillac was taken to the infamous Conciergerie prison and tortured for days. The judges weren't trying to get a confession. They were desperate to uncover a conspiracy. They couldn't believe a man like him acted alone. They were convinced powerful nobles or foreign enemies like Spain had to be involved. They tortured him with the boot, a device that shattered the bones in his legs and used countless other agonies to break him. But through it all, Ravaillac insisted he had acted alone on a mission from God. He showed no remorse. After a quick trial, the Parliament of Paris delivered its verdict on May 27, 1610. Ravaillac was guilty of high treason against God and man. The sentence wasn't just for death. It was a meticulous, step-by-step recipe for agony. First, he would be taken from prison in a garbage cart, wearing only a simple shirt to show his humiliation. At the entrance of Notre Dame Cathedral, holding a lit torch, he was to publicly confess his crime. From there, the real ordeal would begin in the Place de Grève, the city's public execution square. The sentence specified the order of events with chilling detail. First, the hand that held the dagger would be burned off with flaming sulfur. Next, red-hot pincers would be used to tear flesh from his chest, arms, and legs. But it couldn't be quick. Into those gaping wounds, a boiling mixture would be poured: molten lead, boiling oil, scalding resin, and melted wax and sulfur. Each ingredient was chosen to cause as much pain as possible. Finally, the ultimate punishment for a regicide: dismemberment by horses. His mutilated body would be tied to 4 strong horses, which would then be driven in opposite directions to tear his limbs from his torso. And even that wasn't the end. His remains were to be burned to ash and the ashes scattered to the winds to ensure that not one trace of the man who killed a king was left on the face of the earth. This was the sentence. It read like a descent into hell, and the entire city of Paris was invited to watch. On the morning of May 27, 1610, a huge, furious crowd gathered at the Place de Grève. Every window and rooftop overlooking the square was packed. People were practically buzzing with a mix of rage, grief, and morbid curiosity. The grim show began. After his public penance at Notre Dame, Ravaillac was brought to a large scaffold in the center of the square. It was time for the sentence to be carried out, piece by agonizing piece. First, his right hand, the hand that held the knife, was tied down. An executioner brought out a pot of burning sulfur. The hand was plunged into the low, intense fire, which was designed not to burn it off quickly, but to cook it slowly, melting flesh from bone in a drawn-out agony. Next, the executioner's assistants came forward with massive red-hot pincers. They clamped down on his chest, ripping away a chunk of flesh. They moved to his arms, his thighs, his legs, tearing at his body as the sentence demanded. Ravaillac's screams echoed across the square, a sound the vengeful crowd heard as the sound of justice. But the real horror was still to come. Into these raw, open wounds, an assistant ladled the searing liquid of molten lead, boiling oil, and resin. The lead alone, at over 600 degrees Fahrenheit, would have destroyed tissue deep inside his body, while the boiling oil and tar clung to his flesh, continuing to burn. The whole point was to keep him conscious and in the worst possible pain for as long as humanly possible. Through this unimaginable ordeal, witnesses reported that Ravaillac kept praying, still convinced he was on a mission from God. He never showed remorse, only the endurance of a man who believed his suffering was a form of martyrdom. Finally, it was time for the grand finale. 4 powerful draft horses were brought forward. Ravaillac's arms and legs were tied to them with thick ropes. On the executioner's signal, the handlers whipped the horses, urging them to pull in 4 different directions. But it didn't work. The human body is surprisingly tough. Ravaillac's joints and ligaments refused to tear. The horses strained and pulled, stretching his body on a living rack, but he didn't come apart. The minutes dragged on. The spectacle was failing. For nearly an hour, the horses pulled, with Ravaillac reportedly still conscious and screaming. Finally, frustrated by the delay, the executioners drew their knives. They started hacking at his joints, cutting the tendons to help the horses finish their gruesome work. At last, with a series of sickening rips, the limbs were torn from the torso. Only then, after hours of relentless torture, did François Ravaillac finally die. The story of François Ravaillac is a brutal reminder of a time when justice was as much about public terror as it was about punishment. The line between righteous anger and sheer cruelty was often blurry, written in the blood of men like him. This channel is all about exploring these dark and complicated corners of the past. If you believe that understanding the darkness of our history is key to understanding ourselves, then please take a second to subscribe and click the bell icon. You'll help us keep bringing these important, forgotten stories to light. The death of François Ravaillac didn't satisfy the crowd's anger. It unleashed it. As soon as his body was torn apart, the mob surged past the guards. They ripped the limbs from the executioner's hands and fell upon the remains in a frenzy. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of pure savagery, with people hacking at the pieces with knives and dragging them through the streets. Some contemporary reports, filled with the rage of the moment, even claimed that parts of his flesh were roasted and eaten in a final, shocking act of communal hatred. What was left of his body was gathered up and burned on bonfires. The state's revenge didn't stop there. It aimed to erase his very memory. The court ordered the house where he was born to be demolished with a decree that no building could ever be built on that spot again. His parents were exiled, and all of his relatives were forced to change their last name, forbidden from ever again using the name Ravaillac. The execution of François Ravaillac stands as a landmark of cruelty, but it was also a cold, calculated political statement. The sheer brutality was a message from the monarchy to anyone who would dare challenge its power. By making the punishment for regicide a public horror show, the crown proved its authority in the most visceral way possible. It reinforced the idea that the king wasn't just a ruler, but a sacred figure, and to strike him down was to invite a punishment that was almost supernatural. In an age of deep instability, the mangled body of Ravaillac became a grisly monument to the absolute power of the French throne, a warning that would echo for centuries.